So I'm not necessarily a betting man, but I'm willing to wager that you're here because you have a very tough decision. And I should know, it is one that I faced myself. Should I buy the DJI Neo, or should I look towards something from the 00 Robotics camp with the new Hover Air X1 Pro or the new Hover Air X1 Pro Max? Now there is a tremendous amount of things to consider, and it can be rather daunting, but you are in luck today because we're going to walk through each and every one of these models in hopes of guiding you towards the right decision. All right, now the good stuff. We are over on the computer. I sound a little different, look a little different because we're on OBS. And the reason for that is because I want to share a couple different charts that I created that I think will better help you sort out which of these models and which of these drones is going to be the best suited for your situation. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of these specs. So first of all, we have the weight of the Neo at 135 grams, 191, 192 grams respectively for the X Pro or the X Pro Max. We also are looking at a dimension of 130 by 157 by 48 millimeters for the Neo and 173 by 149 by 37 millimeters for the X Pro and X Pro Max. Follow speed, max speed of 31 kilometers, follow speed for the Neo, 60 kilometers per hour for the X1 Pro and the X1 Pro Max. 18 minutes of flight time per battery for the Neo, only 16 for the Hover series. Wind resistance on the Neo, level 4, wind resistance on the X1 Pro, X1 Pro Max, level 5. The range, 7 kilometers with the Neo, only 500 meters with the X1 Pro, X1 Pro Max if it's connected to the phone. But if you connect their beacon, which we will talk about in a minute, you're going to extend that up to 1 kilometer. Next, we have the specs for things like internal storage. So internal storage, 22 gigabytes for the Neo, no ability to expand that. That's all you're going to get, no SD card. X1 Pro, 32 gigabytes of internal storage, one SD card slot with the ability to take up to a 1 terabyte card. The X1 Pro is 64 gigabytes internal and again, one SD card with the ability to take 1 terabyte versions of those cards. Now, in terms of sensors, we don't really see a sensor on the Neo. It's more of AI using downward vision, whereas the X1 Pro also has the AI for tracking just like the Neo and downward vision, but also has rear and side proximity sensors. And this just means it's going to help with any type of crashes or avoiding those crashes. So obstacle avoidance is what we're talking about here. The Neo has 0, whereas the X1 Pro and X1 Pro Max have both rear and side. The rest of the things are all handled via AI and vision. Now modes, the Neo carries a couple different modes. It carries the manual, the FPV, and the auto. The manual just means you're going to be able to fly it either via your touch screen on your phone using soft controllers or hooking up a controller at an additional cost. It'll also give you the ability to do auto features just like the X1 Pro series. I mean, these are what they're designed for. They will have buttons that you can push that can do things like fly arounds, 360s, push-ins, pull-outs, follows, dolly shots. All those are basically going to be the same across the board here. But what's interesting is the Neo has FPV, which means you can hook up goggles and fly this thing manually with FPV, which is pretty cool. Now the X1 Pro, X1 Pro Max, again, they're going to have all those autonomous features, but you are also going to be able to fly in manual, again, with soft joysticks, or you can buy an additional beacon plus joystick, and then you can have a traditional remote to fly these things. Another interesting point is destabilization. We're only looking at a 1x axis for the Neo and a 2x axis for the X1 Pro and Pro Max. Vertical mode, no ability to shoot vertical mode with the Neo, but yet we do have it on the X1 Pro and X1 Pro Max. So if you do a lot of stories or TikTok, this is quite valuable. Some of the other things to note, there is no fast charge on the Neo. It's a traditional slow charge. It has Wi-Fi, but not Wi-Fi 6, but it does have GPS and GLONASS on board. Now, the ability of the X1 Pro and X1 Pro Max to be able to fast charge their batteries is something that I really like, because when you're out in the field and if you do carry an extra battery pack like I do, it'll be really easy to charge these in, let's say, like 15 minutes versus almost an hour for that of the Neo. It also carries Wi-Fi 6 on board, and it does not have GLONASS. Not a big deal. It just has GPS. Next slide we'll take a look at is what we're all waiting for, and what will probably be many of you all's deciding factor. Now, I didn't put the equivalency here, but it's a 1/2" sensor. I believe it's a 14, don't quote me on this, but 14 millimeter equivalency, whereas the X1 Pro is 1/2" sensor, and it is a 17 millimeter equivalent. Now, when we go up to the X1 Pro Max, it's 1/1.3 sensor. I remind you that that is exactly the same size sensor that we're seeing on the upper end DJI drones like the Mavic, and this is a 16 millimeter equivalent. The photos that they produce for the Neo and the X1 Pro, both going to be 12 megapixel. I couldn't find it. I apologize for the X1 Pro. I kind of assume it's going to be 12 megapixels, maybe a little bit more, but I don't think it's going to be anything that will blow your hair back. The aperture on these things is 2.8 across the board. Resolution, this is where it gets interesting. On the Neo, you are capped at a max of 4K 30 frames per second. On the X1 Pro, you're 4K 60. On the X1 Pro Max, 8K 30 frames per second. As far as I know, at least in this class, this is the only 8K drone that you're going to see right now in this class on the market today. Slow motion, we're at 1080 60 frames per second, no 4K slow motion on the Neo. Same thing with the X1 Pro, we are at 1080 120, but remember, we do have 4K 60, so in my mind that'll give you some slow motion at 4K, which is an advantage over the Neo. Now when we step up to the X1 Pro, we're at 4K 120, folks, 4K 60 FPS, HDR. Now the color is another contention. We only have standard color profile, and it's locked into that for the Neo and the X1 Pro, but on the X1 Pro Max we can actually shoot in 10-bit HLG and also in 4K video HDR at 60 frames per second. Our last chart here has to do with cost, and I think again this is going to be a big deciding factor for many of you as well. So the Neo is $199 standalone, $499 for the X1 Pro, and $699 for the X1 Pro Max. Neo does have a Fly More combo that comes with a remote and 2 extra batteries. I misspelled that, I apologize, but here we are. So 2 extra batteries. X1 Pro, $199 for the beacon and controller, and same with the X1 Pro Max. Same beacon and controller work for any of those, but that's an additional cost at $200. Again, what the beacon is just a small little extra device that you can, put it around your wrist, strap onto your bike, put on your car. It's going to give you a live stream as to what the drone's seeing, which is super helpful if you don't want to pull out your phone to look at it. It's just going to help you with framing. But the other thing it does is it provides 2 additional things actually. It provides better consistency with the drone, so it's going to provide better tracking. So that's really important. And it's also going to give you the ability to attach on 2 controllers or 1, whatever you choose, so you can control it just like you would with the motion controller of a DJI, or you can have the traditional 2 tactical buttons, joysticks that you can actually attach. It's kind of like the old DJI one where you'd put your phone in there and you'd use it that way. I don't know much about it other than what I've seen, but that is an additional $200. Now the batteries, much cheaper on the Neo side, $39, $69, or $89, depending on which one you go for the X1 series. And that's because the $69 one is just your standard battery. The $89 is something they're calling their thermo battery. Now this is pretty cool, and the reason for that is because if you're a skier or a snowboarder like I am, this is going to help protect those batteries, and it will function at a much lower temperature. In fact, I believe it's -5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really awesome for folks like me. Now, you have no ND filters on the Neo side, and that's kind of expected, I guess. Maybe we'll see them, maybe we won't, but even in the standalone mode, you can't really pull this thing out of any type of non-manual, or it will just stay in automatic exposure, so it's not really a big deal. I'll talk more about that later when we look at some of the footage. But with the X1 and X1 Pro Max, you can actually do the manual exposure, so you can follow the 180-degree rule and get really nice motion blur out of it. So those are $70, and we don't know if we're going to see them out of DJI, but I don't think we are. I could be wrong. $99 for a motion controller. That's just the one stick controller that you get for the DJI. And then these are not controllers, but just an additional thing that you can get for $169. It's a power case. This is just keeping your batteries warm in cold weather, and then also provide you with the ability to recharge those batteries. So you just pop them back in, you know, and it will recharge a couple times for those batteries. So that's a nice thing to have. So the last section, of course, is you can FPV fly the DJI Neo, and that's going to be $500 to add on those goggles. For the beacon and joystick, if you wanted to buy those separately, perhaps for the Hover X1 series, it's $125 for the beacon standalone and $65 for the joystick. Okay, so I know that was a lot of information. Don't worry, I will have these edited, and once they're edited, I will put them down below and you can download them for your reference. But before we go on to the positives, negatives, look at some of the footage and talk about use cases, let's take the time to highlight a few things that I just want to make sure you understand. First and foremost, in terms of range, 7 kilometers for the Neo, but only 500 meters if you're attached to the phone, and only 1 kilometer if you have the beacon for the Hover series. So that's a vast discrepancy. In regards to frame rates, just know that if you're trying to shoot in anything other than 30 frames per second at 4K, the DJI is off the table. That's because it's capped at 4K 30. And when it comes to any type of slow motion, it is 1080 60 frames per second, which in my opinion, 60 frames per second is just barely okay for some situations when you're using slow motion. Now, if you compare that to something like the X1 Pro, well, the X1 Pro shoots in 4K 60, but it also offers 1080 120. So while it is 1080, it is also 120, which in my mind is true slow motion. The other thing I will highlight is the fact that the cameras themselves have onboard storage. Now, the onboard storage for the Neo is only 22 gigabytes, which even shooting at 4K 30 can fill up that drive rather quickly. And there's no SD card, but the X1 Pro and the X1 Pro Max do have SD cards, with the X1 Pro also carrying 32 gigabytes on board and the X1 Pro 64 gigabytes on board. But again, you're going to need that extra space if you're shooting an AK on the Pro Max. So I am really glad that they did include the ability to put SD cards into them and extend them up to 1 terabyte. Lastly, I really want to stress this because when we look at the footage, you will see how important it is for these drones to follow you. And in order to follow you, they have to keep you in frame and use their AI and their cameras for vision. But one of the things that the Neo lacks is any type of obstacle avoidance. Now, with the X1 Pro and X1 Pro Max, you do have continuous obstacle avoidance, both rear and sides. So this is really going to help couple with that same type of vision AI. And if you have the beacon attached, well, I think the consistency in terms of not crashing and just hanging on to where you are if you make tight turns is going to be greatly increased, not only due to those onboard sensors, but also to the fact that the Pro Max and the Pro have the ability to connect that beacon. Okay, but don't take my word for it. Let's look at some of this footage. Now, first and foremost, to be fair, much of what we see out of the Hover is coming from the folks at 00 Robotics, because these things don't ship until October 31st. So take it with a grain of salt, but it seems like we do have a few things out there in the wild with some few trusted testers. So I'll grab some of that footage and let's take a look. To me, this footage actually looks really good coming out of the Pro. I think, of course, it does show that it has a 1/2 inch sensor, but overall it looks really smooth. So the motion on it is quite nice. I like the natural motion blur. It looks like it's doing a great job tracking. And when we start moving up to, let's say, the Pro Max, well, look at this footage. It's pretty phenomenal, and that's because it's shooting at 10-bit HLG, which is going to give us the ability to color grade. The colors here look pretty good. I don't think they look over sharpened or oversaturated. I really do like what's coming out of this. Do I think it looks as good as, let's say, a Mavic? Well, I don't really know, but it definitely looks on par, maybe a little bit less of what I've seen out of the Mavic, but I'm pretty impressed for this small form factor. Okay, now we get to the DJI, and looking at this video, most of it's very jerky, has very poor motion blur, and it actually kind of makes me sick. I think it looks horrible, if I'm honest with you, and I believe this is because it's locked into automatic, and you're not going to be able to really change that unless you have the remote. So all these people flying this, either I'm wrong and you can't unlock it yet, or they're not doing it correctly, because this does not look good at all. I was unable to find some that didn't have these small little micro jerks, if you will, which is just meaning to me that they don't have the right ratio. So that motion blur just isn't that good. You can also check out here where it doesn't look like the tracking is really that great, because if it does run into anything, which it will, let's say if you're taking a bike through the forest, running through the forest, anything like that, eventually it's going to hit maybe a branch or something like that, because it's unaware of that situation. However, I will say it does seem like this thing is pretty tough and rugged. A lot of this footage that I've seen, there's a lot of different bumps and knocks, and it seems to get right back up and go. In fact, it also kind of recovers itself if it can, and that's pretty neat, but I can see how this could be super annoying. The other thing about this footage is it's super saturated and super sharp. And again, without the controller, there's no way to change the sharpness. Now with the controller, you can bring that sharpness down a little bit and it looks a little bit better, but there is no other color profile or there is no log profile. So you're kind of stuck with this saturation, and lacking any log profile, it's going to be a little bit more difficult in post when you're dealing with color grading and trying to desaturate these videos. On to one of the most important parts, and that is, who are these drones for? Well, first let's start with the DJI Neo. It's great for beginners and the budget conscious, or for anyone looking to get into FPV, for example. I would argue at this point, if you're trying to lean into FPV, you should seriously consider taking a look at the Avata or the Avata 2. Of course, if you have a child, you're ultimately going to crash it. And I think, especially if you couple that with DJI Care, and by the way, DJI Care Refresh is awesome. You should get it. It will add some cost, but you can get up to 2 years protection. So if you have a kid, or you're a big kid like me, and you tend to be a little rugged on your equipment, or you tend to crash things, well, I think that the advantages are really strong and compelling, especially since this thing standalone is only $199. Things like documenting travel, documenting your family, doing some light social media hobbyist stuff, I think that's great. But if for any type of real influencer, or for someone who makes money off of the things they do online, or just has to present a really professional appearance online, I don't think the DJI has enough to be passable in 2024. For the hobbyist and for just everyday posting, absolutely, and it's just fine, and it's probably overkill to get anything more. Now in regards to the acro and FPV, that's awesome, but they're limited. Because this thing is underpowered, it's not really going to do great acro maneuvers, and especially it being so light, it's going to get blown around in the wind. So if you're trying to shoot gaps and things like that, it probably will be quite difficult. The same thing with the FPV. You're not going to get the speed out of this thing, so you're not going to get those zoomy FPV footages and views that everyone seems to adore. However, for $199, heck, I don't even think you can go wrong. It's really hard to pass that up at that price point, but it does lack things like manual exposure, and I just can't get past how jittery the footage looks. I put this in more of the novelty category or toy category. Now I know that it could be used for a little bit more, but in terms of any type of professional work or for like an influencer, I think your money would be better suited with something like the Hover Air X Pro. Now, who is the Hover Air X1 Pro for? Well, this is just kind of that little step above. And you're going to get the same sensor, but you're going to get 4K 60, which is big because you're going to be able to do slow motion. And overall, just because I think the footage looks a little bit better as we've seen so far, I think this is a better choice if you're breaching into more of that professional looking type footage, or you're breaching into, you know, using this to make money, or let's say you're an influencer. I think this is where I would start if I'm doing anything like social media, YouTube, stuff like that, I would definitely look at the X1 Pro over the Neo. It is a solid middle of the road option. Although it's a bit expensive, and really at this price point, you could get into something like the DJI Pro 3, Mini Pro 3 or Mini Pro 4. But again, those are a lot bigger, so it really depends on your use case. I can't stress enough how this form factor is really awesome, and it is actually a pleasure to use and fly. Onto the Mac Daddy. Okay, it's really simple. 8K, 30 frames per second, 4K, 120 frames per second, 10-bit profile. Now I will say that's great, speaks for itself. If you're taking your videography seriously, this is a contender with something like a Mavic. Now the reason I bring up the Mavic and the DJI series is again because for this price tag, especially with the remote control, think about being able to get a Mavic or a Mini Pro 3 or a Mini Pro 4. You're going to be able to do a lot more with it. So I think if this is your only drone, unless you have a specific use case and you need to keep things small or you're intimidated by a larger drone, your first drone might not be this just because it's too expensive. Now, if it's your second drone, this is ideal. And if you have extra money, I think it's a no-brainer. To have these specs in such a small footprint is absolutely phenomenal, and I continue to be blown away by this. So, in conclusion, first drone, DJI, I think that would probably be a better decision. Second drone, or if you're intimidated and just want something small, I do not think you'll be let down by the Max, even if you're going to pay what I call a luxury tax, well overpriced. But I also have another drone, and I'm able to pay this off by my earnings on YouTube. So for me, it was a no-brainer that I would go with something like this as that secondary drone and with those super incredible specs. So anyways, I know this has been a long video. I really appreciate your journey along with me, and I hope that it helps you make a really informed decision and hope it brought clarity in terms of what type of person you are so that you can figure out which of these models best suits you. Anyways, I'm Hill Phantom. I hope you found value in this. Please consider liking and subscribing. I'll see you next time.